A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of violent crime and also mentions suicide. Please listen with care.
A LiSTNR production.
Nick Kaldas is a legend of Australian law enforcement. With over 40 years' experience in the New South Wales Police Force, high-stakes investigations for the United Nations, and leading royal commissions, Nick has seen it all and done even more. Today, Nick takes us into the world of crime and chaos, from going undercover as a hitman to negotiating life or death hostage situations, and even being handed a plastic bag full of human body parts. This is an episode you won't forget. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives. Nick, as a young bloke, you moved with your family from Egypt via Lebanon to come to Australia, which is, culturally a massive thing to do to a young age. I'm just interested in that transition from that, coming from Egypt at that time to Australia, and your transition into joining the police as you're probably 19 or 20 when you join the police. Very interesting transition.
Look, it was a fairly sort of huge or significant turn in my life. I was 12 years old when we came out. We didn't know anyone or anything about Australia, really. I think my father's logic was the line to get into America was too long and Canada was too cold, so we came to Australia. That's about as scientific as it was. But we knew one family here who were very good to us after we got here. It took us a little while to find them, as I outline in the book, but my dad got to a point where he recognised there was no future for us in Egypt and there's no future for him in Egypt, and we had to get out of there, so we did. And, I look back on it, it was an incredibly brave thing that he did. And we lived a fairly luxurious life. He'd done very well. He had a number of businesses. So I'm forever really grateful to him and my mum for biting the bullet, taking themselves out of that comfortable lifestyle, even though there were some risks attached to him at the time, and saying, look, we're going to do this and you'll have a much better future where we're going. We got here and I went to Marrickville de La Salle. We lived in Marrickville first up, and Marrickville, I'm thankful, was an area in 1969 where I think the majority of the class were from migrant families rather than Aussies. So I really enjoyed our time there, and I loved Marrickville de La Salle. It was fantastic. A part of me wishes we'd stayed there a bit longer, but we bought a house and you couldn't buy anything there, so we bought a house out west at Pendle Hill and moved out there.
And as a young boy coming from, 12 years of age, but you're at an age where you would have a lot of memories of life in Egypt, although I suppose there was a lot going on that a 12-year-old wouldn't be aware of, but that was a very much a totalitarian, almost, you were saying earlier, like a Soviet-type state at the time.
Yeah, it was at the time. I mean, thankfully that they've moved on from that, but it was that era of the Cold War between the West and everybody else, really. We'd lived through the Six-Day War. I was 10 around 10 when that happened. And unlike in the West, Brent, most kids in the Middle East would grow up listening to their families discussing, in really great detail, politics and politics of the day and international politics and American actions in the Middle East and the war in Vietnam. I think Middle Eastern communities are generally far more aware of politics, and they discuss that thing in front of. So I grew up listening to a lot of this stuff. It wasn't, you weren't sheltered from it, if I can put it that way.
So joining the police, was that something that because it's, joining the police, it's, as a parent, if your son or daughter decide to join the police, you have mixed emotions about it. What were the thoughts of your mum and dad coming through the life that they'd come to Australia? Is it something that they would embrace for you? Is it something they were a little bit reluctant about? Because that's an interesting career choice.
My dad had passed away by the time I joined, and my mum threatened to disown me if I did it. She was not happy at all. And I tell the story in the book about how there was a sergeant from the local station at the Cogra came knocking on all our neighbours' doors to say, "Do you know this guy? Is he playing up? Is he doing anything bad?" And being the nosy neighbour that she was, she opened the door and said to him, "Is everything all right?" And he said, "Oh, are you Mrs. Kaldas?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm actually here about your son. He's got an application in to join the cops." And she let him in, and they made him a cup of tea. And they sat and talked, and she said nice things about me, and I got in. But she forever, God rest her soul, used to say to me, "I could have told him you're a horrible son that day and you would never have got in." But there's been a few times in my life when I went to Iraq and when I went to Jordan and and certainly when I joined the cops, where she just said, "Why are you doing this? I'm not happy."
Yeah.
But she was always supportive, and I'm grateful for that.
Nick, you're in the job 35 years, and your name would be synonymous with many people listening here. You got to the rank of Deputy Commissioner, and we can't do that career justice. We will have a chat at the conclusion about your book. 35 years in the job. There's thousands and thousands of different things that you do, people you meet. But there's a few key ones here that we're going to chat about that
Sure.
that you have a connection with, and I'm just really interested in hearing that. We're going to start with the job that you're involved in. You're working as a police negotiator, and you attended a siege where a South Vietnamese army veteran had taken his young 5-year-old son hostage in his wife's home. You attended that middle of the night. You were a police negotiator. I'm just wondering if you could set that scene for us and just have a little bit of a chat about that.
Sure. So the negotiators, as you probably recall, Brent, it's a 4-man team. There's the gopher, the person who's new and just really is a gopher. Then there's a secondary who backs up the primary, and the primary is the one that does all the talking. And then there's a team leader who supervises everything and acts as a liaison to the tactical teams and the general duties police and so on to inform. But there's a 4-person cell really who do the work. I was primary on that occasion, and I was primary for quite some years. We got called to a scene at Burwood, a former South Vietnamese army veteran who had separated from his wife, and obviously it was quite a bitter separation. He had come back to the house, their home, killed his mother-in-law, tied up his sister-in-law, and was waiting for his wife to come home so he can kill her. And he had I think 5 or 6-year-old son in the house, which he didn't harm, but he just kept him apart there. The sister-in-law broke free and ran away and raised the alarm. The police get called to the house. She said, he's already killed Mum. So the point I'd make is that it was very difficult, Brent, to try. How do you negotiate with someone who's already committed murder? There's not much you can offer him. There's not much you can say about come out and everything will be all right. You haven't done anything bad. You'll get over this. You can't say any of that because he's already committed a murder. Mm-hmm. Anyway, eventually negotiations broke down and a decision was made. He was becoming more and more erratic, and a decision was made that we'd have to do a tactical solution. The tactical boys would have to go in, kick the door in and shoot it out with him if they had to. And the main concern was that the son was still there, obviously. My job at that point then changed from trying to negotiate him out to trying to keep the son in the front part of the house at the window at the front so that he doesn't get caught in a firefight, which was about to occur at the back, at the side where the entry to the house was. Obviously, when you do a tactical entry, there's flashbangs going off, smoke bombs, and lots of get on the ground screaming and so on. It was incredibly noisy. You could hear it probably a block away. And the son was very, very, he just broke down. He was at the window, but just sobbing and crying and like loudly. And all I could do, my job was to try and just keep talking to him, to keep him with us at the front of the house in the window, away from the entry to the house, which we did do. But I just remember thinking at the time, he's roughly the same age as my son. And it did affect me for a while. And
you're communicating with him through a megaphone.
Yeah,
which is to
through
be
a window.
Yeah, and I just urge the listeners to imagine themselves in that situation. You know, having a one-on-one chat with somebody to talk them down face to face is difficult enough, But the number of sort of physical barriers when you're on a megaphone talking to a young boy who's 5 or 6, who's terrified, through a window, hearing bits and pieces of what you're hearing, but there's flashbangs. That's a hell of a job to try and keep him connected with you.
It was. There was a shootout. I think everyone was injured, but nobody was killed, obviously, so I'm glad about that. But once the police went into the house, and I ended up doing a walkthrough later and came through with Norm Hazard, who's the chief superintendent at the time. This fellow had rigged all sorts of things up in the house. He had aerosol cans on a slow-burning fire with bullets strapped to each can. He had stuff all over the house, really, that were meant to go off eventually if someone got in there. Obviously, he wasn't of sound mind, but I'm happy that we saved at least one kid's life out of that.
I always am interested in this. You come away from jobs like that, and as you said, Nick, there's so many different connections, not least of all the fact that you had a young bloke yourself of a similar age. There must be times where you find yourself thinking, I wonder what that young fella's up to. Did you have any further connection or knowledge of where?
No, I regret I didn't, but I do wonder he must be the same age as my son, which is nearly 30 now.
Yeah.
But the team leader at the time was quite a character in the police, a fella called John O'Reilly, looked at me after we finished and he said, "Are you all right? You look like shit." And I denied it, of course, as you do. Big heart, tough men do. And but I felt it actually knocked me around a bit. It's probably one of the first occasions when I sort of needed to recognise that we're not all 10 foot tall and bulletproof all the time. And we probably, we need to take care of ourselves, recognise when there's a problem and try and do a bit more for each other. And I learned a lot more about all of that, obviously, when I did the Royal Commission into Military Suicides.
Something about attending jobs with kids involved too, I think. A lot of those veneers drop away, don't they?
They do, yeah.
It's not like you're negotiating with somebody. There's psychological issues there. Goodness, this gentleman, South Vietnamese Army, he'd have been a Vietnam veteran. God, who knows the horrors that he's seen. I mean, that doesn't excuse what he did, but there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Negotiating through that with adults is one thing, but when you throw a 5 or 6 year old child into
it changes everything.
Something about that, isn't it? Just stays with you, Nick.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of years in the homicide squad, and thankfully I can only remember a couple of post-mortems that I attended where children were involved. And even that, just the fact that the person on the table is a child really affects you because they're innocent.
Yes.
If it's a bad guy whose murder you're investigating and you watch the post-mortem, it didn't really affect me that much. When it's a kid, it does evoke all sorts of emotions.
It's interesting, I've been privileged to sit across the desk from so many of your colleagues over a few years' time, and it's remiss of me not to remember her name, but there was a woman I sat with who became quite senior in the job, and one of her, like yourself, one of the jobs that she went back to as a young constable was attending a situation where a young boy had been killed, living with his dad mental health issues. And the boy was the same age as her son, just a little fella. Mm. And she said, she did the job, held it all together, went home to her son and sort of broke down. And she said one of the things that she was adamant about as she then got into a role sort of commanding other police and what have you, is she would do everything she could not to send young uniformed constables into those jobs if they themselves had little ones and things. She said it was always something. She said you weren't always able to do it, but whenever you were, she said, I tried to be a little selective in who we sent in.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think generally we're a lot better. Policing generally is a lot better today than we were 45 years ago when I joined, about looking after people, recognising that what we do is a bit of an emotional contact sport and that you might need extra support rather than just saying, toughen up, princess, and go and have 10 schooners of beer. That's not the answer.
I read too in here, and that this is something that jumped off the page at me a bit. You strike me as a very much a hands-on type of a bloke, and in your time in the job, when you look back through the areas that you worked in, you certainly didn't take the easy road. And there must be a frustration also when you're a negotiator, because there's only so much you can do and there's all this stuff going on around you. And I think you mentioned in your book at this point, one of the things that was very difficult was not to sort of almost run in there yourself to save this little bloke. You're stuck on the other side of the fence with your megaphone. Yeah.
I mean, you have to accept you've got a role and you've got to do that role. And we're all volunteers. Nobody's forcing us to do any of this. But I settled in fairly well, I think, in the negotiator role. You use your brain. You have to be absolutely agile. It's a rapidly evolving environment usually. And I really enjoyed doing some good. I was fortunate in all the years I did negotiating. I don't think we ever lost anyone any job that I was on. People talking down from cliffs, people who had hostages and so on. I was blessed really in that we hadn't lost anyone.
And in the role as a police negotiator, that's not a full-time 24/7 role. You're working in other areas of policing, and an incident like this comes up in Burwood, middle of the night. You're on call for that, aren't you? So
you are, yeah.
You may have been working, you may have been at home, the phone rings and off you go.
Yeah. Negotiators, they're probably 70 or 80 across the state in New South Wales. Maybe the numbers have gone up now, I'm out of date. But they're all involved in usually detectives, because if you're on the truck in uniform, it's difficult to pull you off the truck. So if a job comes up, so detectives, at least it's a lot easier to get away to come and do the job. There is a small cell of, I think, 2 or 3 people who are full-timers who coordinate everything, but the rest of them are part-time, and you do a rotating. You're on call once every 5 weeks or once every 6 weeks or whatever. Even that is not full-time. It's not, you have to rotate through, because that week you're on, you're literally, glued to the phone or the pager as it was in those days.
What is it that attracted you to putting your hand up for that? It's quite a unique area of policing. It's not for everybody. Could I hazard a guess that, it lent in with your communication skills? You thought that you could offer something there on that level?
I hope so. I think that's what it was. How it actually started, Brent, is I'm fluent in Arabic, and they were running so there's different levels of hostage negotiators, or negotiators as they call them. And there's a national counter-terrorism level where they need to practice, obviously, for a terrorist incident. And they were running an exercise and went for nearly a whole week in Goulburn Academy out of Sydney. And they needed police who spoke Arabic. So we had 2 guys playing bad guys and 2 guys who were with the negotiators and we had to try and do it in Arabic, which we did. And it was a good team. There were 4 Arabic-speaking New South Wales cops. So I was in the thick of it there. And I just realised, and then they also had a bit of a look at me and said, you might want to think about this. You may have some prospects there, some future. But certainly in the detective space, I knew a lot of the guys who were already negotiators, and they encouraged me and sort of sponsored me to go to do the course and then to get accepted and go in.
And it brings with it high-risk scenarios, of course, but it brings with it, as you alluded to before, I'm sure, these rewards of meeting people at what is, for those individuals, the worst possible time in their life.
Yeah.
And in some way being able to intercept that and give them some assistance and, in literal terms, get them to come back from the edge.
Yeah. It's it probably sounds a bit funny, but it's a very satisfying phase of duty, because it's right in the action. You're doing something. You're actually saving someone's life is at stake. You do get a sense of achievement when you've succeeded. And as I said, I've been lucky. We haven't lost any jobs that I was on. You walk away thinking, I've made a bit of a difference today.
Yeah, it's a great insight. Nick, if I could take you back to 1998, you headed up to Coffs Harbour to take on an undercover role as a paid hitman hired to commit a murder. I mean, this sounds like the script of a movie. Can you just expand upon this one for me?
It probably wasn't as glamorous or as exciting as it sounds. This was a sort of low-level criminal who had been accused of, assaulting someone. He wanted to make sure that the victim wouldn't give evidence against him. And he wasn't sophisticated, and he's just basically a country bumpkin, if you forgive me. So he asked someone, do you know anyone that can come in and kill this guy so he doesn't come to court and testify or give evidence against me? And the guy was a police informant, so he contacted the police, and then I got the job. I did it as a favour, I think, at the time for the investigator who was running the case. I drove up to Coffs Harbour with a couple of support people, and it was a couple of short, sharp meetings with this fellow, and he offered some cash and the details of the victim-to-be, and off we went. It sounds sort of probably more sophisticated than it was. I don't think the offender that we arrested he had no means to check me out, or I claimed to have connections in the underworld in Sydney. I talked myself up and looked the part, all of that. But at the end of the day, he just accepted me. I'd like to think I pulled it off in terms of convincing him, acting like who I pretended to be, which is a underworld figure with heavy connections who can get the job done, and was going to do it myself. And he bought it.
You'd be driving up there. I'm just trying to picture the scene. You're stepping into an interesting realm there, aren't you? You don't quite know what you're going into. You don't know until in hindsight sort of what level this bloke's at, what connection he has.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in the mindset, Nick, of young Nick Kaldas driving up to Coffs Harbour. Back in those days, it would have been probably a 7-8 hour drive. You'd be going through scenarios in your mind because you'd almost have to pick a character that you were going to.
Yeah, I mean, we'd sort of settled on that before we left Sydney. Myself and the fellow who was supervising that job, who later became the boss of the undercover branch, took over from me. For a couple of reasons, we had to go up in separate cars. So I drove my car, and I do remember listening to KC and the Sunshine Band most of the way. I think I had a tape or a CD. I love KC and the Sunshine Band. I didn't think about the hit coming up or anything else. It was sort of relaxing. I quite enjoyed driving and just listening to music. Might make a couple of calls and just getting some alone time. And that's what I did on my way up.
You had a wire on for that interaction with that individual.
Yes.
So everything that he said and you said was recorded.
Yes.
Making it, I guess, a fairly cut and dried case when it got to prosecution.
Yes. I think he pleaded guilty. In the end, I didn't have to give evidence.
Are we allowed to say what the sum was that he offered, Nick?
I think it was around $5,000. It was probably a discounted rate for him because he was so simple. But
I mean, $5,000. Okay, sure, this was back in the late 90s, but $5,000, yeah, it's $5,000, but it's not a princely sum for the job of killing someone, is it, to be fair?
No, it's not. Perhaps it would have been dearer if it was in Sydney. But
Yes. Am I right, Nick? We were chatting off air about this individual. Are you allowed to sort of share with us the fact that he almost went round this roundabout again with another
he
situation?
tried to go around it by taking out another contract on a police officer who's investigating him, and that didn't work either. But I lost track of that in the end. But this was not a well-organised, thought through process or anything. This is a guy with a lot of emotion who was not the sharpest tool in the shed. I mean, who would do that? Take out a contract on someone and they don't turn up at court and no one would ask what happened. No one would look into the motive for that person not turning up at court. It was always going to be a problem. Even if he had got someone who was going to attempt to kill this guy, they still would have brought down a lot of heat on him. He hadn't thought it through.
But, to be fair, in your time in the job over 3.5 decades, you'll have met some criminal identities who are fairly sharp and operate fairly well, but there's no shortage of individuals who are of a similar profile to this gentleman. They're not always the sharpest tools in the shed, are they?
There are some, particularly in drugs, in drug dealing. A lot of them are incredibly clever than them. They practice counter surveillance and some really deep thinking about what they're doing. But there's also a lot of crooks. I mean, there's no IQ test to enter into the criminal milieu. It's just people who just want to make money. It used to be a bit of a joke. So I've worked in the armed hold-up squad, and I've also worked in drug and major crime investigations. And the joke with the guys in the drug squads, they used to say that bank robbers are usually people who are not smart enough to deal in drugs. So there's something in that because it's sort of rough and tumble doing an armed robbery, but it doesn't take an awful lot of brains. Whereas in drug dealing, you've got to deal with also, is the person buying an informant? Is he an undercover police officer? Who am I buying off? And are we watched? Do we talk on the phone? There's so many issues drug dealers have to deal with. Some of them are incredibly, in an evil way, incredibly smart.
I'm just imagining this chap in Coffs Harbour meeting you for the first time, no background check, no nothing. What could possibly go wrong?
I think he was actually very nervous. He's meeting with an alleged underworld figure from Sydney who'd driven up there. And I said to him, I'm not here. I'm not going to take any crap. What do you want? Just get out, come out with it. And off we went.
Not to be outdone, he got done for, and then went round again. I mean, that is quite incredible. You'd sort of think there'd be lessons to be learnt, but clearly not.
No.
Nick, this case in Coffs Harbour was a fairly short, sharp operation which led to an arrest. I know during your time in the job, the areas that you worked in with the gangs, drugs, one thing and another, you would have had numerous occasions where you were undercover, possibly for short periods of time, other times longer. It's always been very interesting to me to sit across the desk from police who have been in that world and the different techniques or the different ways that they present themselves to these offenders so that they can sort of move within those environments. Did you have a technique, Nick, that sort of worked for you?
Yeah, I found, and I think most people who work in this space would do the same, that try and stick to their actual life story as best as they can Obviously changes things that might identify their real identity. And then there's less chance of tripping up. But you've just got to sort of think it through. And then you have to focus on acting and saying and being who you say you are, rather than slipping up by saying something where that's not in character.
Yes.
It's really important, obviously, to be absolutely switched on. Every single word when you're in action has to be spot on.
But you were quite, and this is a technique which I've heard numerous times, is you're less likely to get tripped up if you are actually presenting yourself as almost who you are, with your cultural background, where you came from, where you grew up, the area that you lived in and things.
Yeah.
Because you could be talking to somebody who says, "Oh, hang on, I grew up in Marrickville around about that time. Who owned the corner store?" And you go, "I can tell you exactly."
Yeah.
It's all those things, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, with me as well, being an Arabic speaker, a lot of the jobs I did were sort of in that milieu with Middle East organised crime. And one thing I would never pretend to be is not declaring where I come from, because language-wise, I can't fake a Lebanese accent. Well, you can for a little while, but sooner or later you're going to trip up. So you're better off sticking to your actual roots, and then that's fine. I'm just remembering a funny story, if I may. When I joined the police first, the detectives would be going in to do a search warrant on a family of Lebanese background or Arabic background, and I'm in uniform just along for the ride, and they say, "Nick, don't say anything, don't let them know you speak Arabic, and just listen to what they're saying so we know whether they're hiding things in the house." And I said, "It's not going to work. Have a look at me." Anyway, they said, "Just do it." Okay, yeah, all right. So we'd go in, and as soon as it happened a couple of times, I'm not saying, don't say anything, just stand there and listen to what they say to each other. And we'd go in, and as soon as they looked at my head, they burst into Arabic. And they can't. We are what we are.
Nick, following the fall of Saddam Hussein, early 2000s, around 2004, you were deployed to Iraq to assist in the rebuilding of the Iraqi police force. One morning during that deployment, you attended the scene of an assassination attempt of an Iraqi colleague. Pretty gruesome scene. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So I was a state police officer, obviously New South Wales Police, but through contacts I had in the FBI and the US DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, they were looking for volunteers, I guess, senior police from the Western world to come to Iraq to help rebuild the Iraqi police and modernise it and bring it into the 21st century. So I got a call. I agreed I'd go, and then I was seconded. The federal government was part of the coalition of the willing. And without getting into politics, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with everything George Bush did, or actually the invasion itself. It was probably based on erroneous grounds. But I went to help the Iraqi people stand up again, to rebuild themselves after the fall of Saddam in 2003. So I was approached. The federal government said that I would deploy as part of the group of Australian advisors in various fields. I remain to this day, I think, the only serving Australian police officer to have served in a formal capacity in the Coalition Provisional Authority. So I landed, and ultimately I was appointed as the Deputy Chief Police Advisor and the Chief was a fellow called Douglas Brand, who's a Deputy Commissioner from South Yorkshire in the UK. And we got on famously, 6'8". There's a lot of stories you can tell about him and his interaction with the Iraqis. They have a Minister of Interior who, in the Middle East, the Minister of Interior is the person who commands all of law enforcement, border force, any customs and all of that sort of stuff is all sort of centralised under one person usually. And then there's a number of Deputy Ministers of Interior. This particular day, one of the senior deputies, Minister of Interior, they were all, as we were, targets of the insurgency, which was led by Abu Musab Zarqawi at the time. He's now dead, thankfully. And they were targeting senior people specifically. So he had a protection team. He had a motorcade, the deputy minister. And as he was leaving, something happened. I think he might have gone inside to get his keys or something. But they had formed up the convoy, and he'd walked back in. And he was just walking back out, as I recall. And as he was walking back out, a suicide bomber hit his motorcade, and quite a large number of people died. But he was badly injured, but he survived because he wasn't in the car. He was just coming back out from the house. We, on the day, I was with Douglas Brand, and we agreed we needed to go out. And to sort of wave the flag, I guess, to see if there's anything we can do, and to talk to people on the ground and to talk to him, obviously, as well. And we did that, but the whole neighbourhood had come out and they were very angry. You're not protecting us. They're saying, you look at the mess, you're not protecting us. And we're in the middle of discussions. Some of them were quite heated with people and some of his staff and so on. And this fellow who I think had worked for him, and I sort of vaguely recognised him without paying much attention, it was quite a heated environment, very emotional. Everyone was very emotional. Many people died on the spot. And this fellow was tugging at my shirt. And I just sort of waved him away 2 or 3 times. And he was very upset. He was crying. And then eventually we'd finished the conversation. I said, "What's up?" And he had this shopping plastic bag that he'd gone around and picked up people's fingers and hands. And he was just sobbing. All I could do is hug him. Yeah. It's really brought home to me, and I think I mentioned it in the book, the evil that we were up against and the fact that you can't, this is not something you can negotiate or talk to or ask them to be rational or sensible. There's none of that. This was a brutal, really brutal, violent insurgency that in fact at one stage was condemned by Osama bin Laden as going too far. Mustafa Zarqawi adopted methods that were just outrageous, just inhuman, the torture and the killing and so on.
You went up there, Nick, with close to 25 years policing experience, and you'd worked in homicide and gangs and all sorts of environments. But I think, as you say in the book, this is, and as you've just mentioned, this is next level.
Yeah.
I mean, the suicide bombing as a means of taking people out is something that we don't really or haven't had experience of in Australia here.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, the evil that was being practiced was also quite innovative. They were doing things like getting a dead donkey or a dead dog and cutting it open, filling it with explosives, sewing it up again and putting it on the road and then exploding it as a car went by or a car drove over it. It's quite innovative. But I do recall, I think we had to talk to people from the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I think the psychologists before we deployed. Then they talked to us about the threat environment and the fact that it may affect you and you need to be conscious of that. And it was suggested that you may develop some bad habits that you didn't have before you went there. And I remember, after 25 odd years in the cops and being in the homicide squad and the hold-up squad and whatever, and I just thought, that's rubbish. That's not going to affect me. I'm a big, hard, tough guy. And after we had a few bad weeks where actually people in our office were attacked. Thankfully, they all survived. But we had some bad days. And there's a group of the senior police advisors used to get together at the end of each day, of which I was one. Particularly the Americans would all want to smoke Cuban cigars because it's difficult to get them in America, I understand. And I remember thinking they'd offer me one to say, "No, I don't smoke. I've never smoked." And then after a few really shitty weeks, they said, "Do you want a cigar?" I said, "Yeah, I'll have one." Next thing you know, I'm having 2 a night. And then I got home and I sort of felt the need to continue. And my kids said to me at the time, "You stink. We're to go stop smoking." And I still really enjoy it once in a while, but it's not a nightly event anymore.
Nick, you mentioned in your book, after being at that scene as horrendous as it was on so many different levels, you sat on the SUV, you're driving back and you're looking out the window and you remember what went through your mind.
I just remember thinking, how are we ever going to battle this? How will we ever stop this? What do we do? And there's really no answer. There's a much bigger political picture, obviously, and I think, it's a 2-hour discussion you can have about what went wrong in Iraq. And if I ever invade a country, I'll do it differently, as they say. But the bottom line is the coalition and the US in particular obviously decided to sack the entire Iraqi army. That's hundreds of thousands of men who were battle-hardened, no future, no prospects, no job, nothing. And then the coalition again sort of raced towards the capital, towards Baghdad, and left, we were informed, a number of compounds, simply put padlocks on them and left them in their rush to the capital. And then they came back a month later and it was all gone. So we had a very large group of really disgruntled individuals with no future or prospects who wanted to bring down the government and expel the invaders as they saw us. And they had the wherewithal to, they had a whole lot of equipment and materiel and weaponry that they had access to. We almost created the insurgency, I think. I think the de-Baathification process, the process of getting rid of anyone who was in Saddam's Baath party, went way too far. And I was asked many times, particularly once by Richard Myers, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we briefed him at one stage, and I was told to be candid. And he asked if it had gone too far, the de-Baathification process, and it clearly had. I think if they had tried to embrace or allow for people who had been members of the Baath Party, who had no choice in surviving under Saddam to join the party, I think we punished everyone when we shouldn't have, basically, and it cost us dearly.
So the civilian population, understandably, is at the very least sceptical of any foreigners coming in. What was it like working within the Iraqi police, trying to rebuild that? How were you met there? Was there scepticism there? Was there fear? Was there respect? How did that work?
It actually worked reasonably well. I'm fluent in Arabic, obviously, which did make it a bit easier, obviously, unless there was some Westerners involved. We just did our meetings in Arabic. But I made lifetime friends, I think, among the Iraqis, and I think they're wonderful people who have just been through hell. Certainly the last 20 years have been absolute hell for them. By and large, there was a great sense of cooperation. Where we had problems more often than not was where the expectations and the demands, I think, particularly from the US administration, sometimes were unrealistic about timelines and about what could be achieved and how it ought to be done. And I saw myself, and certainly Douglas Brand and I were locked in step in not protecting the Iraqis, but just making sure that we're not asking them to do something that they don't want to do and is not feasible and will probably not, it's just not going to happen. So we try to inject some ground truth, as the Americans call it, into the thinking and the demands that were made of our hosts. By and large, I think they were happy to be rid of Saddam. Nearly everyone I spoke to had an experience or someone close to them who had a dreadful story about what Saddam and his family had done to them. So there was no love there, really. But by the same token, I mean, at one stage it was said so-and-so can't be promoted within the police because his English is not good. And I was very upset about that, and I went off about that because it's not a criteria. He was a good leader. He was someone who was going to get the job done. We were only going to be there for 12 months or whatever. Long after we're gone, we put a numpty in who just because he can speak English. I mean, that's the sort of mentality, I think, and the sort of issues that we sometimes had. So if we were fighting with anyone and not agreeing, it was hardly ever the Iraqis. It was actually internally within particularly the American contingent.
Sounds a bit like the police force.
I can't comment on that.
You went back, I think, am I right in saying you did three tours, deployments there over. Yeah. So this was 2004. This was your first one?
Yeah, I went in very beginning of January 2004, and I was there most of the year. I think it was September, October.
Yes.
And then not long after that, there was a jihadi website that claimed that 3 Australian security workers were being held hostage, and the Australian government obviously was very concerned. So I ended up deploying with 2 federal police officers and a contingent of Australian military in response to that. We were there for a couple of months, about 6 weeks, I think, from memory. Just really did a really thorough environmental scan. There was no one missing, and there were no hostages. It was a scam. I think, among other things, we made recommendations that the Australian Embassy ought to try and encourage a bit more actively that Aussies who were working in Iraq in whatever capacity, and it's usually security at that stage, should register with the embassy so that they know who's there and who's not, and with their contact details. And I think that they did that after we left.
And Nick, I guess the bottom line is proof in the pudding. After your 3 or 4 different tours there, could you sit back now and say that there was ground made, that there was positive things that came out, there was some green shoots, at the end of that, your 4th deployment as opposed to your 1st?
I honestly don't know, but I have great hopes that a lot of the things we did were green shoots, in fact, and had been nurtured and gone well. We established the National Crime Squads. We established the National Criminal Intelligence Service. We re-established the Interpol office, which connected them with the world. I was part of the discussions that established the National Security Council, chaired by the Prime Minister, which also I think was a very positive step, getting all the relevant people in the room and making sure that the coordination, collaboration, communication simply didn't exist before we invented all of that stuff. And I was very, very happy and quite proud to be a part of all of that. Their forensic services, while they had some really clever people, as they did in all arms of policing, because of the Saddam regime, they had been shut out of the rest of the world. But the forensic staff in particular were very good. Everyone had a PhD and so on. We agreed with the German government to train them. The Germans weren't going to send anyone into Iraq because of the danger. So we agreed with the UAE government. We were very supportive. And we flew the staff out to UAE for a rolling series of courses and lectures and obtaining, really modern equipment rather than what they had at the time.
And do you keep an eye on that part of the world now, Nick, from afar?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I try and watch them. I've got millions of cousins, some of whom still sort of live and work in different areas, as well as Egypt itself, obviously. But I do take a real interest in that, and I've been fortunate a couple of universities have used me to do the odd lecture for people who are studying terrorism and politics in the Middle East and so on. I hope I give them some insights into what happens on the ground.
And I guess we're moving back into some unpredictable waters currently with on the international political scale, just with events of the last few weeks, and of course the Middle East. There's always a turbulence there, isn't there?
There is, yeah. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but it's a particularly turbulent time at the moment, and really dreadful with tragedies in every direction. I think everyone who's sane prays and hopes for peace in every direction, because there's so many people suffering at the moment in the region. And there's a couple of forgotten conflicts. I mean, Ukraine's just come up again, but it had been forgotten for about 12 months. And Sudan, which is under the radar and no one's paying attention, there's an insurgency there as well and a war going on. And certainly the Christian minorities there are being particularly singled out, which is really, really, quite horrible.
Nick, you were appointed as the chair of a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. It was a commission that went for several years. I'm just really interested in your role and what it is that you're involved in that capacity.
Sure. If I can start at the beginning, Brent. So I was approached by the Federal Attorney General's Department to take on the role of chair. And I did sort of and ah a little bit about it. It's unusual for a non-lawyer and particularly a non-judge to actually head up a Royal Commission, but we did discuss it. You don't get to find out who nominated you or what thought processes were there, but I did have discussions later on with people in the federal sphere, and they said, look, you've run certainly major investigations. This is really an investigation. You have experience of living and working in war zones, but you're not military, and you don't have an allegiance to any military background. And there were three of us. I was the chair, but there were two fellow commissioners. One was a former Supreme Court judge from Queensland, James Douglas, and the other one was a psychiatrist and former head of National Mental Health Commission, Dr. Peggy Brown. So we brought very, very different, but I think very relevant perspectives there. The psychiatrist, the guys in the office used to joke that it was the perfect opening line for a joke, but we never got a judge, a cop, and a psychiatrist walk into a bar, and off we went. The other reason I agreed, and it did take me a little while to agree to accepting the role, is that I saw and have always felt there were a lot of similarities with mental health issues and suicidality and PTSD, similarities between the military and police and emergency services. And certainly as the 3-year term moved on, I very much firmed up in my view that there are similarities. So I've had discussion. I was fortunate to the commissioners of police who meet regularly agreed to give me some time and went down to Melbourne and met with them to discuss what we knew and what we learned in the Royal Commission. And I'm happy to talk now to the New South Wales Police Association about anything I can help with in terms of recognising mental health issues and giving them solutions from what we've learned from the Royal Commission. But the bottom line, Brent, is that it's really hard. I mean, there were a lot of issues, obviously, and still are with special forces in Australia, the SAS and the commanders and so on, and allegations of things and what have you. It all takes a toll. But it's similar to the police in some ways, and there's no shortage of Royal Commissions into corruption and policing and inquiries into people who are at the sharp edge, detectives who get complaints from criminals and so on. It all takes a toll, not just on you personally, but on the family. But I think probably the biggest lesson I learned out of all of that is that for society generally, we have to find a way to make it more acceptable, to remove the stigma of big heart, tough men and women being unable to say, look, I'm not well. I actually need support and help rather than criticism and isolation. And uniformed services generally, with the best intentions on people's part, if Nick or Brent break a leg, they say, that's fine, we'll keep talking to him. If you say, look, I've actually got mental health issues, I'm suffering from PTSD or whatever it might be, nobody knows what to do. The answer is to isolate them. And the organisations themselves have harsh rules where I know in policing generally, the first thing they do is take your gun off you and put you on a lower level of duty where you're not allowed to interact with the public and so on. And the military is the same. They call it being medically downgraded. And once you get military downgraded, you actually can't do your job. So you don't have a purpose, I guess. You're probably sitting in an office or a corner somewhere and no one comes to see you much because they're just not sure what to say. And it becomes a self-feeding cycle where you spiral and it gets worse and worse and worse. If I could just mention a couple of statistics that really struck me, and I think listeners ought to know this, and I think society and the media have a huge role to play because there hasn't been much interest in helping veterans when they come back from war zones, nowhere near adequately. And we discovered that there had been 57 inquiries that preceded us, handed down something like 770 recommendations. Hardly anyone had gone back to make sure that the intent of those recommendations had been met and acquitted. And that's a huge issue for us. And that's why we've recommended a permanent body to monitor what's going on, to monitor our recommendations being implemented, and make sure that forevermore they watch this space and report publicly. And that's the key to it. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. The other, I won't say interesting, but sad statistics that I learned is that up to 80% in any given year of veterans and serving members in the military who suicide have never been to war. So it's not, for some it is the blood and gore. It's the same for the police. It is often the blood and gore, the car accidents and the murders and the rapes that they've been to and so on. But there's also this majority of instances where it's how the organisation treats you. It's what's happening in the barracks. It's how your chain of command treats you. It's the unfairness of the promotion or the disciplinary system. It's the disciplinary system being weaponised against you if you dare to speak against or make a complaint against superiors and so on. The other interesting, or not interesting again, but very sad statistic is that this fortnight, as we sit here and talk, this fortnight, we will lose 3 in the veteran community or serving community. On average, we lose 3 a fortnight. It's continuing. And we lose 20 times as many to suicide as we have in battle or exercises. Now, the problems are clear, but society and the media, I have to say, have not been that interested in pursuing this agenda and asking questions and holding politicians to account. Those 57 reports, and we think the number is much larger, but we identified 57 that relate to all aspects of suicidality and causation. I'm not sure that any prime ministers actually read them. Maybe ministers of defence have, maybe ministers of defence personnel have, but nobody went back and said to the Defence Department, the Department of Veteran Affairs and so on, you've got to do better. I've got this report on my desk and I want an answer in X number of weeks and so on. Our terms of reference required us to look at the 5 I's, US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and obviously Australia. And I just found, particularly in the US, there is far more interest in the political class and in the media about veterans' issues and their welfare. Perhaps it's because a much larger proportion of politicians in the US have served in the military. That's my sense. I don't have statistics to prove it, but a lot of the people we met had all served, and they cared. They actually cared a lot more than the political class here did. I'm sorry I've got on my soapbox there. I didn't mean to, but I do feel quite strongly that those men and women have done everything we've asked of them. They've worn the uniform, they've gone where angels fear to tread, and then when they needed help at the end of it, more often than not, in many cases, they've been let down.
You must have seen, sitting on a commission like that with your 35 years in the police, you must have seen such strong parallels between the issues for Defence Force and veterans to serving police and ex-police.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's one of the things that motivated me. Some of the stories we did almost 900 private hearings or private sessions, as they're called, for people who, for one reason or another, were not going to give evidence in public. Nearly 350 people gave evidence in public hearings that we held in every state. And we got just under 6,000 submissions, written submissions. And some of those submissions may be 10-lever arch folders. There's a lot of material. There was a lot of information. We had a really good team. It was up to about 150 staff all up. We went for 3 years. I hope that one of the things we did is that people felt heard. And certainly a lot of the feedback we've had is so many people sat across the table from us and said, I'm not asking you to do anything. I've been waiting 25 years for someone to listen to me, just to hear my story. And you're absolutely right. The parallels with policing were startling. So many people are victims of the system, if you like, especially if you get in policing. It's so easy to attract complaints. You're not dealing with happy customers usually and people you're arresting. They usually, and I can think of 100 cases where I've arrested someone and they got sentenced to 15 or 20 years, they've got nothing better to do than lodge complaints. There's no skin off their nose if nothing comes of it. But it takes a toll on the individual and obviously sometimes their family and their loved ones as well if you're under investigation. And we have had cases where people have suicided in policing simply because they were under investigation, even though they hadn't anything. It proved later that they hadn't done anything wrong. As a society, I guess is my final message, we really need to do better in looking after those who look after us.
I was really interested in that stat you mentioned that around 80% of those, tragically, that suicide from the Defence Force didn't have any actual active deployment. And there's that parallel to policing, isn't there, that you speak to any police going back, goodness me, 40 years when I first joined, you like yourself, the people leaving the job, the complaints that people had about the job, it was never really to do with what they were doing out on the street, dealing with the crims, and that was actually the easy part.
Yeah.
I was in a riot squad, riot unit for 2 years, and they're throwing you into all these different scenarios, but you dealt with it. It was okay. What did you head in was the hierarchy discussing something over 6 or 8 weeks that you had to make a decision in a heartbeat running into a situation. And it's that stuff that often grinds the troops down, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really what's happening in the barracks or the meal room. It's how your workmates are treating you. It's how your chain of command are treating you. It takes so little effort to be kind to people, and it takes a lot of effort to be horrible. I don't know why they make the effort.
Nick, you're in the job 35 years. You worked in a lot of environments where I've spoken to ex-colleagues of yours on this side of the desk who are very open about their own struggles with post-traumatic stress. Did it ever come knocking on your door, Nick, at any time during your career?
Yeah, it did, and I do talk about it in the book. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, I think. I'm not proud to say, Brent, when I got back from Iraq, I had very bad PTSD. I knew I had all the symptoms. I knew I had it. But I was in a bit of a battle with the hierarchy of the organisation. They refused to promote me for quite some years. No reason was ever given nor discovered. It was just politics. The last thing I was going to do in that battle was to put my hand up and say, also, by the way, I'm not well. So the environment is really, against you in encouraging you to put your hand up and say, I'm not well. I felt it, and I tried to be aware after that of people around me and people who worked for me in particular, who needed help, who I can help, who simply couldn't put their hand up because it would have attracted this stigma, and your career would pretty much be finished after that. You never really recover from it if you put your hand up, both in the military and in the police. They'll never forget that you had a nervous breakdown or you had PTSD or you had to go and see a psychiatrist. You carry that stigma normally for the rest of your life.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because let's talk about policing now. There is a greater accessibility for police who do struggle with that. And you get young coppers attending fatals and things where, back in our day, you just literally get on the drink after work to deal with it. And that was often a way of sort of, that was that sort of Pavlov's dog thing that the more stress you felt, the more you drank. And we know that a lot of police have had a lot of trouble in that space. So we've got to a point where I guess it's becoming a little more accessible to get the help that you need. But what I'm hearing from you, Nick, is it's the stigma around it.
Yeah.
For let's say the young copper, he or she that puts a hand up can access it. Well, that's all great. But the damage can be done when they're coming back on section and they're treated differently there.
Yeah. You've summed it up very well.
Yeah.
That's basically it. And I mean, there are so many good programs done. New South Wales Police, under the Commissioner, Karen Webb, has started a whole unit that's dealing with these issues and looking solutions and so on. I hope at some point there is more collaboration nationally in Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand's in the mix as well. The Commissioner was in the room when I spoke to them about learnings out of the Royal Commission. And I think it's really worthwhile just keeping an eye on what's happening internationally. We found everywhere we went, some things we were doing much better. Other things, we learned a lot about how, as I say, it's good to learn from mistakes, preferably other people's. There's a bit of that as well. But I think it's really worthwhile to do an environmental scan once in a while in this space.
Interesting the comparison you make with regards to the military in the US. I mean, goodness me, the US has its problems. Let's not shy away from that. But both of my kids have lived up in the States. My son is still up there. And you travel up there, the respect in which they hold those that have served.
It's completely different.
It's a totally different level.
Different to Australia.
You can't attend a sporting game without them presenting members of the military. And they're often members who have, lost limbs and things such as that. You're talking standing ovation, tears in the grandstand. And I can't help but think Nick. Now, that adulation can perhaps at some levels go a little too far, possibly, but I can't help but think a society that holds those within the military so closely to them is a society that is going to be more affordable with regards to understanding mental health as well as those physical.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll ever get to a point in Australia where they afford former military or serving military. We'll never get to the point where they treat them the way they do in America. But there is definitely that absolute respect. And, they say, thank you for your service. I think at one stage here there was a minister that issued a direction not to use the term thank you for your service because it was too American. Well, right. I mean, did we have an alternative?
Yeah.
You've got to say thank you. I sort of despaired a little bit at various points during the Royal Commission when I saw some things that were far better than what we were doing here in other countries. And we made recommendations to try and bring us up to the standards that others had. I should finish off on the Royal Commission by saying that I'm really heartened that the current Albanese government, with support from the opposition, so we called for bipartisan support. It should never have been, and it never was a political issue. Both sides of politics ought to agree on support for veterans. But I'm really happy to say that a couple of months ago, Prime Minister Albanese announced they were going to accept 104 from the 122 recommendations we made, including the main one of establishing a body that monitors what's going on and reports publicly. There's a couple of other ones that were quite significant, but that's the key. It's people, not in a bad way, but they just said, well, you're just a 58th inquiry. You're not going to achieve anything.
But you did.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
I think the jury's out. So much depends on how they establish this body, who heads it up, the power they give them, the access they give them, and whether they listen to them or not. I have my fingers crossed, and I remain cautiously optimistic.
Nick, you had a book published called Behind the Badge. Your motivation behind writing the book and your target audience? Yeah,
I hope I encourage everyone to buy it. I need the sales. I felt I had a story to tell, the places I've been and what I've done. But I resisted for many years. A lot of people said to me, but a couple of people sort of not inspired me, but talked me into it. One was Gary Jubilant, obviously, and he's a former policeman, worked for me in the homicide squad many years ago, and he's written 2 books now, and I think he's really gone ahead in the media with that. The other one is a fellow called Bob Baer, B-A-E-R, who is a bit of an idol of mine. He's ex-CIA. He was in Lebanon during the Civil War with the CIA, and his first book was called The Company We Keep. They call the CIA the company, colloquially. And it's a fabulous read. He dedicated the book to his kids, and he said, I hope this goes some way towards explaining where the hell I was. Now, I think anyone who's deployed to shitty places and spent long periods of time away from their family recognises the toll it took on their family. And so I did the same. I've actually dedicated the book to my kids and to the men and women of the New South Wales Police, serving or former. And I felt it was a way at the end of the day to leave behind a story, if you like, of how we went from Upper Egypt, from the south to Cairo, and then from Cairo to Sydney, and then the things we've done here and we've achieved. My brother was a doctor. He gave up medicine and went into the priesthood, and then he just finished his PhD the same time as his son finished his PhD, and I'm sort of the failure in the family. But the bottom line is, it was a record, I guess, of a legacy, if you like, for my kids, grandkids and great-grandkids. I hope people enjoy reading it. I hope they get a laugh out of it. And if they can't sleep, perhaps it'll help.
And that name again, Behind the Badge, you can get it from any of your favourite bookstores or online, I'm sure. You can
HarperCollins as a publisher,
and all that sort of thing now.
Yeah.
Nick, I just want to thank you so very much for coming. Nick, I'm going to say something here to you. I said off air, and but I'm going to say it. I've done about 80 of these interviews over the last couple of years, and
fantastic.
Your name has been mentioned more than any other commissioned officer in New South Wales, and it has been mentioned by officers who I've sat and spoken to, both past and present, who I would put up there as the absolute bread and butter and the backbone of New South Wales Police. Each one of them has mentioned you and asked, are we going to talk to Nick? Are you going to get Nick Kaldas? And Nick, I would say that you are held in greater esteem than any other commissioned officer that I know of. And having sat here with you for an hour and a half, I can understand why. You're a man of the people. You would have been somebody that never, ever forgot where you came from, and that can't be said for all that reach the level that you did. Nick, I do want to thank you for your service, that 35 years of service to the good people.
You're very
of
kind, and
Wales.
the guys who said that are very kind as well. I'm just incredibly humbled, and I feel really privileged to have actually served in all those roles.
It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here, Nick. Thanks for
Thanks
dropping
very
in.
much, Brent. Thanks, mate.
That's it for this episode of Crime Insiders Detectives. Join us later in the week for Crime Insiders Judgment and Crime Insiders Rewind. And next week, another episode of our Forensic series.